Thank you for inviting me to present at Once in Future Fantasies. My name is Quinley Brady, and my paper is Changelings and Disabilities, How Fantasy Changelings Reflect Real-World Disabilities. I'm very grateful to the organizers for allowing me to present my paper virtually. I wish I could be with everyone, but I am recovering from surgery. Many of you may know Heather Dale and her song, The Changeling Child. This is a quote from it. How their home was joyful, the son called their own, but soon they saw the years that passed would never make him grow. The fairies would not answer her, the stones were dark and slept. A babe was all she asked for, and their promises they kept. The fear of losing one's child goes back to ancient times, and in fairy tales, this fear has manifested itself in the form of stories about stolen and changeling children. In these stories, a new parent notices something wrong with the child that they have given birth to. Unbeknownst to them, the baby has been stolen by the fair folk and replaced with an imposter. These imposters, or changelings, are often described as ill or otherwise sickly. The parents then have to figure out whether this child is actually a changeling. This can be done through trickery or by violence to the child, and sometimes with the help of a fairy doctor. In the end, the parents can cause the fairies to bring back their real child, either by threatening the changeling, seeking out magical remedies, or making a deal with the fairies. There are similarities between the scenario of the changeling child in Celtic fairy tales and situations faced by modern-day disabled children and parents. In particular, there are parallels between parents' appeal to magic in changeling child tales and parents' appeal to medicine for their disabled children in today's world. In both contexts, parents call on special powers to restore their true child, the child that they expect to have. Unfortunately, this can cause a rift between the parents and the child, because it communicates that they do not love the child as it is, and that the child needs to be fixed. As someone who is disabled with mild cerebral palsy, dyslexia, and impaired vision, I find researching the similarities between changelings and real-world disabilities to be fascinating. While I became familiar with the legend of the changeling child through Irish fairy tales, it is also an important theme in other European traditions. For this paper, however, I will be primarily focusing on Celtic legends. If a parent is concerned that their child isn't behaving normally or in a desirable way, that is, if the child is sickly or ill, suspicion may arise that they could be the victim of fairies meddling in human affairs. A changeling is often described as being a sicklier version of the child that it replaced. For example, in A Brewery of Eggshells, the mother observes that, quote, although its face was so withered and its body wasted away to a mere skeleton, it still had a strong resemblance to her own boy. End quote. The changeling still resembles her child, which stops the mother from doing anything violent to it. For example, putting it on the fire. The description of changelings as a sicklier version of the human children suggests a connection with disability. In fact, this connection is more than a simile. Sugg noted that, quote, in the 17th century, Christians used changeling as a loose synonym for the mentally disabled, end quote. Since the word could also refer to disability, any changeling child tale is telling two stories simultaneously, a fantastical tale of fae folk and a worldly one about the disabled population. When parents suspect their child of being a changeling based on their actions or appearance, they may resort to traditional remedies. These direct parents to find out the true nature of their child by using violence to figure out whether they are a changeling or not. These tactics are very similar to witch hunt tactics of torture to determine if a woman is a witch. If she drowns, she isn't a witch, but if she floats to the surface, she is. In fairy tales, parents may resort to violence towards changelings. This can be to prove they are in fact changelings, or as part of a scheme to convince the fairies to bring them their real child back. For example, Yeats describes one way to determine that a child is a changeling. Quote, "Lay the changeling on the fire with this formula, burn, burn, if of devil burn, but if of God and the saints be safe from harm." End quote. The story The Changeling gives an example of this tactic of recovering the real child by doing violence to the changeling. In the story, Miss Hawes, quote, "stripped the wee scrap and threw him on the burning coals." End quote. The fairies then come back to return the real child and take back their changeling. Quote, "The casement windows screeched. They brought the burn then. They laid him safely on the mother's lap." End quote. Because of the double meaning of changeling referring to changelings and the disabled, the stories of the violence used towards changelings has seeped into reality. Attackers have used these stories of changelings as an excuse to commit and models for their crimes toward disabled people. There are documented cases where violence done to changelings in fairy tales crossed over to violence against disabled people in the real world. In these cases, claiming that someone is a changeling has been used as an excuse to torture or kill them. Many of the victims were children who were physically or mentally disabled. Their attackers claimed to have intended to get the real child back through violence. In fact, not only children were harmed in this way, there were disabled adults as well who were harmed with the excuse that they had been stolen by fairies and replaced with changelings. Examples include Bridget Clary, who was murdered in 1895 when her husband claimed she had been replaced by a changeling. In 1840, a boy named John was made to confess he was a changeling through torture. He had a back condition which was, quote, "curvature of the spine, which kept the boy in bed for 2 years," end quote. Through torture, he was made to reveal where his parents' true son was, telling his torturers that, quote, "the real John was in the farmer's house," end quote. John's disability today could be interpreted as an extreme case of scoliosis. His condition was viewed as an unnatural deformity, and the Changeling Child Tales gave his torturers a way of interpreting his condition. Because of the violent actions involved in getting a real child back from the fairies and tales, he was put through extreme and horrible violence. For the story of the Changeling Child to end happily, the parents need to get their real child back from the fairies. Sometimes it is easy, but other times they need to call in the assistance of a fairy doctor. In some variations of Changeling Tales, it is easy for the parents to get their real child back. For example, in the tale, The Trooping Fairies, we hear that, quote, "sometimes the fairies fancy mortals and carry them away to their own country, leaving instead some sickly fairy child or a log bewitched so it seems like a mortal pining away and dying," end quote. This fate befalls the mother's child, but it was easy for her to get the child back, for the fairy tells her that, quote, "it was the others who stole it," end quote, and, quote, "as for the fairy, she wanted her own child back," end quote. So she was able to negotiate to get her own child back without any of the dangerous tactics that could result in death. In this case, both humans and fairies agreed to re-exchange the child and the changeling. Usually, however, it's not this easy, and the human parents must enlist magical help to get their child back. In fact, in some fairy tales, the parents consult a fairy doctor or people who have wisdom about changelings. For example, in one fairy tale, the parents, quote, "seek out a wise old woman who was said could instruct the parents what to do to get their own child back," end quote. Following the double meaning of changeling, this is similar to how modern-day parents must enlist modern-day doctors or therapists to get their real child back by removing a disability. Fairy doctors or healers are sometimes even referred to as elf doctors. These healers have an ambiguous relation to the Fae. Some fairy or elf doctors are said to get their power directly from fairies. For example, the, quote, "physicians of Muv Dubai," end quote, were, quote, "reputed to have gained the powers from a fairy woman who emerged from the lake," End quote. Usually these doctors are called upon when the fairies are causing mischief. It does not always have to involve changelings. Sometimes it can be an illness or death of livestock. For example, one farmer consulted an elf doctor about a sick cow, and the elf doctor, quote, diagnosed the beast as badly struck by the fairies, end quote. On this particular occasion, the farmer did not believe the elf doctor, but this episode illustrates the practices of consulting these healers about real-world problems. Thus, in real life, as well as in folktales, fairy or elf doctors are able to tell someone that they or a loved one has been fairy-struck. In the case of Bridget Cleary, whose murder was mentioned above, a fairy doctor was in fact consulted. Bridget's husband, Michael, quote, had sent for herbs gleaned from a witch doctor type named Eniskini, end quote. In the modern world, disability media often reflects what society as a whole thinks of disability. Often characters are portrayed as inherently being different because of a disability, either in a negative or falsely positive way. Further, the view that a disabled person are less than human, or not their true selves, not only appears in films and the media, but also spreads out into the real world. In the modern world, a parent may give birth to and then realize something is wrong with their child. Because of that, they may enlist the help of doctors to try to get their real child back. An article from The Atlantic describes a girl who had been through an accident that affected her brain. Her parents considered that there were two different versions of her, saying that it was as though they had, quote, two daughters in a way. One that has passed away, and now this one, end quote. Her father even, quote, thought of it as if Livy died, and that there's this new child here, end quote. There are strong parallels between these parents' strategies for coping with their loss and the belief of parents in fairy tales. Going along with the parallels, Livy's parents say that there, quote, are flashes she shows of her former self, and we hold out hope that she's coming back, end quote. Here again, there are parallels with the parents in fairy tales. Livy's parents talk as though a fairy had taken Livy's true self and replaced it with someone else. The analogy of fairy tales explains the paradox that they describe Livy as having died and hold out hope she may return. This is a modern iteration of the changeling story, replacing absence with death. It follows the same idea of the real child being taken away somewhere, whether it be to the afterlife or to fairyland. As with the historical cases, the connection in society's conceptions of death and disability have the possibility of being taken too far, endangering the child and the relationship between the child and the parents. The similarities between fairy tales and real life help explain the psychology of parents, and they also point to real dangers for disabled children if the parallels are taken too far. If an individual with a disability is treated as a different person from their non-disabled or former self, it can cause serious real-world effects. It could be neglected or mistreated. If abuse does not occur, this actually can cause a bad relationship between parent and child. The parents in the Atlantic article actually had good intentions in their actions toward Livy. They are helping their daughter by giving her accommodations. However, if the changeling analogy is taken to extremes, it can cause harm to both the parents and the child. Because of the difference that I feel from other people, I do sometimes wonder if I am a changeling. Had I lived many, many years ago in Ireland, I might very well have been considered one. My disabilities would be perceived as having supernatural cause. When people become aware of my disability, I notice that they view me and treat me differently. People who have not had experience of being disabled can be misguided and believe there are two kinds of people, the abled and the disabled. While in some cases it is easy to view the world that way, it is more complex than that. If taken to extremes of both sides, the abled and the disabled, there will always be someone who is extremely disabled or someone who's extremely abled. But there are those in between, like me, who are disabled, but the disability is invisible. On the outside, I appear to be an able person, when I am not. Several of my teachers have not known how to react when they discovered that I was disabled. This is because of my disabilities. They tend to be invisible. I'm aware of the pain I feel when my muscles tense. I know the annoyance of not being able to read when my eyes are not aligned, but no one else sees these things. From my personal experience of being disabled, I have often found that people seem to think that fixing a disability is the way to solve everything. They seem to think that people who are disabled are weird or strange for looking or behaving differently than the norm. I even had a conversation with someone that became almost eugenicist about how healing disabilities would cause less discrimination to the disabled. In reality, I believe this would cause more discrimination. The speaker didn't realize that the person they were talking to, me, was disabled, but their mindset reminded me strongly of the changeling fairy tale, of the desire to fix people who do not fit the norm, in order to get the real person back. In conclusion, changelings and people with disabilities are both challenged by what their parents and the rest of the world expect them to be. Thank you for having me.